Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, people have outlined in detail, including the previous Speaker, the member for Kingsford-Smith, very clearly what Labor's position is in relation to this bill, and that is, of course, we will support it, but we've removed some second reading amendments, and they are done very, very seriously. I want to restrict my remarks to Schedule 2, which extends consumer protection provisions of the ASIC Act 2001 to cover funeral expense policies. I have spoken previously to the Treasurer about the seriousness of this particular part of the legislation, and it goes very much to what I'm sure previous speakers have spoken about from this side of the House, and that is around funerals. Now, the Hayne Royal Commission, as has been clearly outlined, made some very real comments about the efficacy or lack of efficacy of the Aboriginal Community Benefits Fund. And I just want to speak very clearly about that and the absolute need for the government to make sure that the people that have invested in that scheme, and we know that there are thousands of those people, are not disenfranchised because of the passing of this bill and the potential for organisations to fall over. Within the Aboriginal community, and I will outline it here very clearly, the life expectancy, as people know, of First Nations people is much, much shorter than others. The rate of disease is much, much higher. And I have to say that there are communities that I'm very aware of, many funerals that I have been to that are of people that are young, people that are very young, and had they not been Aboriginal, would still be with us. We know that infant mortality is much higher. We know that death from homicide is much higher. We know death from suicide is much higher. And we know death from a number of diseases, including cancer, in particular heart disease, is much, much higher. We know diabetes is much, much higher. And these are often comorbidities. So the issue of death is also, from a cultural perspective, viewed in a very different ways. And I can't tell you, Madam Speaker, how many funerals I've been to where people say to me, the only time we see each other now is at funerals. And that is the reality for First Nations people in this country. Thousands and thousands and thousands of First Nations people have taken the steps of investing early, and they've believed they've done it appropriately in funeral benefits funds. Thousands. In fact, just during the holiday, and I pay tribute to my very dear friend, Mr. Graham Mooney, who died a dreadful death, who died far too young, and I spent most of my holidays, as many others did, helping to organise and officiate at Graham's funeral. Graham had invested in this fund, and it is so important that the government understand, and the departmental people understand, that this is a very real issue. We're talking about people that are poor. We're talking about people who have not wanted to burden their families because they knew their families could not bear the cost of a funeral. So they often in very difficult circumstances, have invested into this fund. And it is absolutely critical that that group of consumers is taken particular notice of and particular care of if the passing of this legislation is going to null and void those insurances. Many of them have been paid over and over again because the investment was often when people were very young. In fact, there are many circumstances where parents actually sign their children up to these funeral funds because of the circumstances that I've outlined. So I urge the government, from a very human perspective, to please take notice of this and please make sure that this group of consumers, I think we were talking about, about 19,000 people, are not disadvantaged by this legislation. That would be a dreadful unintended consequence. That would be a cruel unintended consequence. And I once again put on record that it is absolutely critical that this group of consumers is considered in the passing of this legislation. If they are not, it makes a mockery of the reason that we are supporting this bill. And if they are not, then it really does add another dreadful mark to a sorry history. Like I have said, people have invested in good faith for the absolute right reasons, and that is not burdening their family with the expense of a funeral. They've invested in these funds because they know the death rates of Aboriginal people and the ages of Aboriginal people in this country. Now, we're not talking about statistics here, Madam Speaker. We are talking about real people and real families. And I once again urge the government to make sure that the consideration in the implementation is in fact very much having the group of people I'm speaking about considered appropriately.
I thank the